Hello, everyone. This is recording number 7 for a class on early Greek philosophy. We are still talking about Heraclitus, and today we turn to the famous pronouncement that one cannot step into the same river twice. Now, this pronouncement is contested. It is not clear what it means. And in particular, it is not clear whether Heraclitus, with this pronouncement, expresses what is called a flux metaphysics. Now, what is flux? One way to approach this is to ask, what is the difference between change and flux? So here's an example for change. Assume that there are leaves that are green and they turn yellow. So you have the leaves and they change their color. And the way in which people think that that is change, at least in the context of this discussion, is to say, well, there is something that persists, a stable object, the leaf. And then there is something that changes its color. It turns yellow. So change is, as it were, defined here as having something that is stable and something that changes. And that is what is not the case in flux. In flux, the thought is there just is nothing that persists. So you're kind of thinking through cases, adding ever more layers of change and dimensions of change, such that it then appears that there simply is nothing that is stable. For example, you may think, well, the leaf doesn't just turn yellow, it also kind of changes its shape, it also moves, and then there is a cognizer who looks at the leaf and the cognizer changes, and then there are surroundings, and maybe the light changes, the viewing conditions change, and so on and so forth. So you kind of then take that to more kind of, as it were, microscopic levels of analysis and imagine a world where everything is in every way constantly in change. And then you no longer have objects such as leaves. So that is, at least in a kind of rudimentary sketch, what Plato spells out in his dialogue, the Theaetetus, as a metaphysics of flux. And he ascribes this type of theory to Heraclitus, and then Aristotle also ascribes this type of theory to Heraclitus. And that way, Heraclitus becomes, as it were, the proponent of flux metaphysics. However, scholars nowadays think that Plato just gets it wrong, and that there is a follower of Heraclitus called Cratylus, who makes Heraclitus's views kind of more extreme, and that is kind of what Plato is familiar with and what he then takes further. So the picture that you have then is that Heraclitus is presumably just what you may call a change theorist and not a flux theorist. And that is a fairly widely held view in the literature. So how would this work, let's say, with the river? For example, James Warren argues that we can kind of think of this in terms of change. So we can identify something that is at rest and something that moves. We can make a distinction between the river, which he says stays the same, and the water that flows along, which is in motion. So we have kind of paradigmatic change, something that persists, something that is in change. Now, I want to challenge that picture a little bit. I want to suggest that Heraclitus, whatever else he does, he seems to challenge our ordinary worldview. And that kind of picture of change, where you have objects with changing properties, that is pretty much our ordinary worldview. And Heraclitus seems to make pronouncements that are intentionally paradoxical and ambiguous and, challenging. So it would be surprising if then in the end he just says, well, it is kind of as you always thought it is. So if we turn to another formulation that is kind of in the neighborhood of this river doctrine, then that helps us think about it a little more, I think. The formulation says it rests by changing. And what is interesting about this is that here Heraclitus identifies the same thing as that which is at rest and that which changes. And I think that speaks against the move to say, well, let's just make this distinction between the river and the water, and then we have something that is at rest and something that changes. And then we may also turn to further formulations that relate to the river doctrine, which involve people who step into the river. So that may kind of help us envisage the kind of dimension of change that I mentioned with respect to the leaves. We have a cognizer or person who steps into the river, and that person changes and the river changes. So we have already two dimensions of change. And I want to suggest that it is at least a worthwhile experiment to read the surviving material about the river doctrine in such a way as to look for, as it were, the starting points of such additional dimensions of change. And if we find them, then it may look as if there are at least the starting points for a theory of flux.